Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in today's video, we're going to cover what's new in Plasticity for 25.2. Now, we won't be able to cover everything because, of course, there are a lot of improvements and enhancements. We're going to cover all of the new commands, and we'll try to touch on a lot of the modeling enhancements and improvements that are going to affect the day-to-day workflow. If there's anything that we missed, we'll put all that information in the description of the video, as well as a link to the Plasticity site where all of the new commands are highlighted there as well. So the first thing that we want to talk about is a new command called align. Now this command is only available in a studio license. So if you are an indie user or if you are on, let's say, a trial version, you're not going to see this command because it is powered by Xnerves. So what we want to do is, in this case, I'm just going to select two edges and I'm going to find the align command. You'll instantly note that the surface on the right-hand side has disappeared. And essentially what this command is allowing us to do is it's allowing us to create a new surface that has curvature continuity, or in this case, G0 is the default, but G1 or G2 continuity, and allowing it to gradually transition from one to the other. So it's keeping our second selection, and the first selection is beginning to go away. Now, what you will also notice is if we go to, say, G1 or G2 continuity, it completely disappears. Now, the main reason for that is because it doesn't have enough degrees to actually create that shape. We can play around with all these options, for example, increasing degrees and spans to get it to keep more of that original shape. And we can even turn on some different options for the boundary. So for example, normal or natural, next or adjacent. With only having two guides, a start and an end, those aren't really going to show you much different there. But you can play around with all these options, increasing things like the degree and span. And there is a partial alignment section that you can open up. So partial start, partial end. And at the very bottom, some new tools such as these analysis tools, which will tell us whether or not we have G1, G2, or G0 continuity. So you can see here it checks out and it gives you that sort of tolerance value 0.01. G1, you can see here it's within 0.01 degrees. And then G0, it's perfectly fine because all that means is it's connected. So a good on-screen indicator. Now, if we happen to go to something like G0 and we try to look at G1 continuity, we'll also get these curvature combs on the screen. That'll give you a good indication as to whether or not you're getting the proper alignment. So now that we have this, if I go to look at my points or my vertices, you can see that it's showing the raised degree vertices on here that we can then continue to play around with and increase or decrease or move them around to change the shape of this. So for example, I can move these up if I want to modify the shape. So a great way to get started creating a complex design by using some very simple inputs and playing around with the dialogue. Now, inside of that, we had that advanced option talking about curvature continuity. That is also available as its own tool. So we have something called measure curvature and measure continuity. So we can look at measure continuity for any number of edges. It doesn't have to be on one we just created. So for example, if we want to make sure that we've got a smooth transition on the side door here, we can go to measure continuity. And we can see that we've got G2 continuity, and you can see there it's 0.5. If we go to G1, you can say it's within 0.02 degrees, and G0 perfectly fine because they are connected. So again, it's a great way for us to get an indicator on the continuity across multiple panels on a design. Again, we also have these tools for things like measure curvature. This will give us curvature combs on the screen. We can get a good indicator at the quality of the curve that we're using on an input. So for example, this model was created quite a while ago. If I take a look at, let's just take this edge here and measure continuity, you can see it's kind of all over the place. Now, part of this is going to be based on things that happened during the creation of that curve. So for example, if sheets were extended, if a fillet was added to it, then those are all going to have an impact. But as you're going through your design, this is a good way that you can identify problem areas and areas maybe that you need to go back and do a little bit of cleanup and make some new edges, new surfaces. So those are great new additions to the Studio and Indie version, but that Align tool, that new tool is powered by Xnerves. That's only available in Studio. While we are talking about measuring continuity and looking at our designs, there is also a new shader mode option that allows us to put this sort of overlay of curves on our design. This is a pretty neat way that we can identify and look at the curvature of a design, so we can see whether or not we need to make some changes based on what we think the curvature should do on a design like this. So pretty neat, a cool way to get an idea of how your designs are progressing, especially if you're doing complex surfacing work. Another thing is the Unlock All tool. So for example, right now I can't select the rims and tires. You can see that they're locked up here in this group, and the solids down here, these are all locked. We now have an option to unlock all in one go. So this is pretty handy, especially if you've got multiple bodies, surfaces, sheets, solids that are locked in different groups. You can take care of them all at once, and then you can go through and you can select those. So pretty nice to have that. That's a new addition for 25.2. There is now an addition of export commands. So we've always had export commands available in this sort of command dialog, but now we can export an SAT or a step file directly from here as well. So those are new commands and new additions and ways that we can access those tools. The last thing that was added, which I believe is new, is the select all option. So if we hit A on the keyboard, we can select basically everything that's visible currently. You'll notice that the curves are not getting selected. If I select a curve that is, let's go ahead and just show a couple curves here, and I hit A, notice that those are now becoming part of the selection. So again, pretty cool that we can now do that by just simply hitting A on the keyboard to select everything that's visible. This is great if we want to move objects around or if we want to group things together. So if you've got a bunch of sheets that are visible and you want to join them all together, you can just hit A and hit J on the keyboard to combine them into one single sheet. All right, so that's the end of the brand new tools. Now let's talk about improvements, new features that have been added to existing tools so we can get an idea of what other things have changed. One of the big questions I get all the time is, why doesn't this feature work, whether it's a loft or something else? And something that's changed for 25.2, at least with the loft command, is now we have the ability to get an on-screen warning that makes a lot more sense. So for example here, too many vertices to loft in one go, try lofting in smaller chunks. That is a very helpful warning or an error message that we get, where in the past it may have just said something like loft failed and you really don't know why. So it's a good indicator that we can play around and maybe grab smaller sections of our curves or edges and loft them in smaller chunks and then join them all together. So it's a pretty neat feature that has been added to the loft command. All right, so now that we've got our points visible, let's go ahead and talk about another change that's happened. So in the past, if you were working on a raised degree surface like this and you wanted to move points around, move the CVs around, then you would really need to go in and box select, which could be kind of a pain, especially if you've got things at an angle and you just want to say, grab these, but maybe a couple extras are coming in there. Well, now we have the ability to hold down Alt, and what we can actually do is we can select the entire sort of chain or row of these CVs, and that greatly increases or improves our ability to modify these designs quickly. So if you've just got a design with a couple of CVs, it's probably not a big deal, but if you've got a complex shape that you're dealing with, then having the ability to hold down Alt, like you can do now with edges, so for example, just holding down Alt will allow us to grab basically that loop. That is a nice addition to be able to do that on complex sheets and surfaces when we're dealing with raised degree. While we're talking about selections, something that we've been able to do in Plasticity for a while is hold down the left mouse button and then roll through the mouse wheel and get a list of the objects that are underneath the cursor. Now, the problem with this is if you move the cursor at all and start to create a selection dialog, it doesn't work. And for me personally, I've never used it because I generally use my pointer finger on the mouse wheel and on the left mouse button, so it's never felt real comfortable to me. Well, the new addition here is we can hold down Shift and Control and left click, and that will bring up all the things that are underneath the cursor, just like holding down the left mouse button and scrolling the wheel will. So that's a pretty cool way that we can get access to it now. So especially if that is not a comfortable way for you to work, holding down the left mouse button and scrolling through the mouse wheel, this can help that just by holding down Shift and Control. While I've got this sort of new spoiler started, let's go ahead and talk about some other tools here. So we've got Extend, has got a few new options. So inside of the dialog here, we've got Select Target Shell. And what we can do here is we can select a target we want it to go to, and it'll extend the sheet and terminate at our selection. So that's a pretty nice option. We've also got some additional options for things like limit. So minimal, outside, inside. So if you're dealing with, say, extending a sheet up to, let's say, a cylinder, then you can determine whether it should stop on the inside or the outside, for example. So pretty nice, especially if you're working on a design and you need a sheet to extend all the way to another sheet or another body, then you can just simply use that target as an option. Now, that works on the extend command. Extend command can also work with a curve and a vertex. So those can be targets as well. But in most cases, at least for me, I would be extending one sheet to another sheet. That would be the common use case for me. All right, a couple more things I want to talk about before we move on to another model to look at some examples. We've had some changes to the assets and shaders. So we've already talked about the ability to basically put those lines on there. There's also an option here talking about the surface curvature direction or the normal direction here. So you can see the spoiler is blue on one side and red on the other. So you can use a reverse tool to flip that around. And this is a good indicator where the normal direction is on those surfaces. And if we go into our render mode, there are some new options in the render mode where we have different HDRI environments that we can play around with. You can modify things like the rotation and the intensity of it, so darker or lighter. And those are all great options to be able to basically improve the way that you can convey the models you're working on. There is also ambient occlusion, and you can modify ambient occlusion properties. And you can also see that there is shadows that are displayed on the ground plane here. So all of these are big improvements, especially for visualization purposes. You can play around with the different environments, rotate them around, modify their intensity, and get just not a full render, but a better visualization option. There have also been some changes to perspective. So basically the ambient occlusion options can be turned on for render mode and for the basic shader mode. It's important to note that you really need a good GPU if you're going to be using it in shader mode. And so with the perspective camera, the perspective has changed. It used to be set at 50 and now it's at 35. And that is an option that you can change if you notice any clipping on your model. So something that used to happen, especially with really large or really small models, is you may get a lot of clipping, and you can go in and manually adjust that value to make it lower if you find that you're still getting clipping on your models. Some other things that have been added in terms of visualization in the assets panel in the outliner, you'll notice that there are a lot of different materials that have been added. So for example, if we take a look at this is supposed to be a grate here. If I double click and add that, that hex metal material, I can play around with things like the scale and go ahead and make it smaller. If it's not lining up properly because this is a curved surface, you can play around with the rotation and get it until it looks to be okay. Maybe rotate it that way. And again, play around with all the basically settings. So as we move around, we could maybe apply that to here as well. And the way that we do this is you select an object, and let's go ahead and I'll use this perforated metal. I'll just double click. And then when we select the perforated metal, that's when we can start to play around with it. And again, just use all the options to rotate it until it's applied to your surface properly. So that's a nice way that we can, again, add a little bit more realism to the design. You can see that we're looking through it. So it does meet all those properties. It would help you really convey the design quite a bit better by applying these materials. And there's a lot of them in here, things like polished marble, car paint, brass that's oxidized, or old or new copper, things like that. So really nice to be able to have these inside of the asset outliner, just to be able to apply them and play around with them and modify them as needed. The last thing I'll mention here, since we're kind of talking about the display and the UI before we move to another model, is if you happen to redock your toolbar to the right side, it will now remember that setting for you. So one thing that's happened when we got version 25 is the ability to move this around because of the change in where we access some of these tools. But it didn't remember where you put that. So if you happen to redock it on the right side, it will remember that between sessions and even after you restart. So it should keep on the right hand side if that's where you like it. So I know anybody that went back to where it used to be, that was kind of a pain point, but it should keep that now if you happen to dock it back on the right side. So what I'm going to do now is just hop into another model. We'll talk about a couple of additional things that have been updated for 25.2. So the first thing that I want to mention is the Boolean command now has a new option called region. So I've got these three surfaces or three sheets selected. And if I go into the Boolean command, by default, it wants to cut. But if you look at the operations here, we've got this one called region. And what this allows us to do is keep basically the solid or the watertight volume that is created by these overlapping bodies. So this is a really great option. This is something that I use all the time to create, let's say, a liquid inside of a container, or in manufacturing, sometimes we'll do this for creating things like a mold cavity. Another thing you'll notice inside the Boolean dialog, and you may notice this in other dialogues as well, is these advanced options that are popping up on the bottom. You'll notice that there is now target and tool material. So if you are using this for, let's say, other operations like removing one body from another, you can dictate the material based on those settings for what you have selected as a target or a tool body. We can also do things like keep the tools if we want, including and also keeping that original solid. So I'm going to right click, and if I hide the sheets, you'll notice now we just have this leftover solid body based on those settings. Another thing that's changed while I have this on the screen here is we have some new fillet options. So you'll notice inside of here there is a tension setting. This tension setting allows us to essentially increase the tension that is driven off of the tangency of the other portions of these edges. So you can see here that we can make a tighter transition. If you go all the way to 0.99, it's going to try to go to a sharp corner. This will work in some cases if you're dealing with a prismatic part. For something like this that has a complex top, it doesn't work as well. This does work in most cases. So if you go from a conic to a G2 or to a chordal fillet, then you can play around with these options. From what I understand, it does not work if you do a full round fillet. So if you are using a full round fillet option, then this does not give you the ability to increase the tension. But in most cases for conic, G2, and chordal, it will give you that option to play around with. So again, nice quick way that we can make some pretty high quality edges. In the past, what we would have to do is delete that face and then use something like the square tool or loft from one edge to the next, and then drive those tension values for G1 or G2 to get something like this. But it's directly built into that fillet tool now. Next, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the cut command improvements and also imprint improvements. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a line that doesn't go all the way through this object. And if I try to use this as a cut tool for this body, notice that it fails, obviously, because the curve doesn't go all the way through. We now have this extend option, which will actually allow us to extend the curve. So that way it goes all the way through the body, and even if the original curve didn't. So this is pretty nice. It's handy, especially if you are using things like the cut tool all the time. You can just make those curves shorter and not worry about them extending all the way through those objects. All right, so another thing I want to talk about in addition to the cut tool being able to extend is the imprint tool also has this imprint tools options where we can now imprint to both bodies that we have selected. And then we also have this complete target, which essentially is allowing the edges of those tools to extend. Now, this isn't a perfect solution, and what I mean by that is you can kind of see what it did with the cylinder. It didn't take the cylinder all the way down. So in some cases, you'll find that you just need to take your tool down farther with a cylinder. Obviously, that would be pretty simple. And in some cases, it will just extend out in a tangency direction. So for things like this, you can see that it is able to extend that out properly. So this is nice. Again, cut has the option to extend the curve. Imprint body also has this complete target option, which we can allow it to extend, and you can imprint on multiple bodies at the same time. So the main way that I would probably use this is if I had multiple surfaces and I wanted to do something like a mutual trim, I would be able to do that by using the imprint tool on those multiple bodies. So probably the last thing I want to mention in this video is going to be the addition of tension handles when we're using bridge curve. So if you are doing complex surfacing and you are using a lot of these sort of surfacing tools to create your shapes, then you're probably familiar with the bridge curve tool where you're going to be going from one curve to another. In release 25.2, we now have these yellow handles, which allow us to manually move them on the screen. Again, we can still set things like G1, G2 continuity, and you can play around with those handles. We can also go into the analysis section and turn on curvature combs. So again, another great on-screen visualization where we can play around with the curves and figure out how much tension we need to have on each of them in order to achieve whatever curvature goal we have for our design. You'll notice in a lot of the tools, you want to pay attention to the dialog at the bottom, or you may have an advanced section or an analysis section, especially with things like curvature tools or surface sheet tools. Then just pay close attention to that bottom section and whether or not you have things like analysis tools available to you or an advanced section where you may have some new advanced options. So that's going to do it for the updates that we want to talk about today. There have been many other updates, some new tools like there's a fork material tool. This tool is supposed to create a duplicate of the material on the body you have selected, and then you can begin modifying that new material. What I have found so far is that it's not actually duplicating that material. So if we, again, go into our tools here and we go to fork material, it's Shift and M. What you'll notice is, let's go ahead and just do it here, Shift and M, that it's just going to be changing the current material and calling it a new material. So I think this is probably something that just needs to be worked out. I have seen how it's supposed to work and it should create a duplicate of that. So that's something I expect to be fixed in the near future. Some other things that have changed, there are improvements to the loft tool, improvements to isoparams, and just general improvements all over the board, mainly focused at things like visualization as well as complex surfacing. So if that's the kind of work that you do, then keep your eyes out for all of these new options. Now, if you are looking to purchase Plasticity, we are an affiliate. You can use the code LEAD10 at checkout to save 10% and help out the channel. And just keep in mind that some of the tools you find, things like the new Align tool, are going to be studio only tools. Anytime you see a tool that uses XNURBS as the basis for it, or in some cases, file conversions, whether import or export, some of those are going to be studio only options. But a lot of the new tools being added, things like measuring curvature and continuity, those are baked into the program at both the indie and the studio level. So if you're unsure, make sure you do a little research before you buy a license and figure out which tools you actually need. What I would say is if you are doing a lot of complex shapes and surfacing, then I would look long and hard at the studio version because the XNURBS, the square, the Align tool, these are all extremely handy when creating complex shapes. If you have any questions on anything that we did cover here or some of the tools we didn't, then please leave a comment below. And as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.